Craig. Thanks for coming today. Thanks
You're
for
welcome.
finding us. Sounds like you had to walk around a little bit.
No, it's good.
Knock on a few doors. Work
Yeah.
out who was bored, apparently.
I found it. I found it, so we're all right.
It's all good. We'll jump straight into it then. So today I'm just going to go through a few different questions and eventually find out what really matters to you.
Mm-hmm.
But first of all, can you remember how we first met? And it wasn't in person, was it? And I can't remember either, so this is going to be interesting what you say.
No, so this is yeah. So I started working at UE Bristol about 2.5 years ago, and one thing that I used to do, my last institution, was work actively with people in the community, because I think that's exactly what universities should do, and particularly universities such as UE, which should be embedded in the community as an ex-poly post-92. So I kind of just looked around for different programs and different organizations that kind of made sense to me, or something that I think would work. And then I came across your organization, and I looked into it. I looked some of the, I asked people about the organization, and then I think I reached out to you. Was that right?
I'm not sure. It feels better if that was the case.
Yeah, no, but
let's go with that.
I think we then had a chat, because that's something I used to do, and I remember being working with 2 or 3 organizations over my last institution. Yeah, it's good, because I like to engage with what's happening on the ground, and that informs then good practice and research.
I think you might have reached out to start with, and I have a feeling after you reached out, I started looking in and done a little bit of research, and there was other things that kind of aligned with interests, passions, and everything else. So I'm glad you're here today.
No,
because I'm sure we will talk a bit more about that stuff.
You're welcome.
But first of all, so what was it like for you growing up? What was the positives? What was the challenges?
All right. So I grew up just outside Dundee, which is the northeast of Scotland. And Dundee has changed, although, like a lot of cities, it's this image that the cities have changed. It's more or less central areas that have changed than the exteriors. So I grew up in a place called Goosecroft, which has tenements, and I grew up in the bottom. But interestingly, people think of this image of tenements being quite violent, et cetera, and whilst that does exist, I had a great childhood. There was hundreds of kids to play football with, and we were never in, as in those days in the 80s. So for me, it was just a case of playing football all the time, and I wasn't really what I would describe as class conscious and who I was in relation to everybody else who existed in the world. And that came much later. But for me, it was just a case of going to school and getting through school. School was a place that you just kind of met your mates, and you learned something, hopefully. But for me, there was nothing there that would be significant in relation to, or at least I thought then, in relation to what I'd be doing now, which is obviously focusing on young people, youth work, and youth crime, and all these different things. But I was surrounded by elements of that as well.
I mean, so when you were growing up in the tenements, did you see any of it? Because it sounds like you had a really positive experience. The stereotype, innit? Let's be honest, of like tenements in Scotland. For me, I can't talk for everyone else. It's like probably because of all the stuff you see on TV and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Sensationalism, maybe. I don't know. It's always like drugs, violence, this, that, and the other. Is it something you just didn't see, or is it just case?
This is the interesting thing. It's only when you reflect back. So again, communities are different, tenements are different. So the days that I grew up are different now. So the tenements are still there. And whilst, on the face of it, it does look like deprivation, it does look like disadvantage. But I know people who still live in that community, etc. But communities do change. But for me, the only thing that I noticed was we were told not to go to certain flats. So as kids, we were like, you don't go there and you don't go there.
Right.
And that was it. But again, I think that's like in any community.
Yeah.
So, we knew that was there. We knew that was there. And we knew that some people worked, some people didn't work. The majority did, because the work was available. And we just got on with it.
What was the kind of work that was available in your community?
Yeah, so it's mostly, Dundee offers what we call the old jute industry. So my father was a weaver.
Okay.
And then it's something called polypropylene. So the northeast of Scotland for oil, and polypropylene is a byproduct. which is actually underneath all the carpets and it's in the roof and all that sort of stuff. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
So my father worked in a factory for 45 years, as did many people. My mum was a cleaner.
Okay.
And had 5 jobs. She was a cleaner at the school, the doctor's surgery, and stuff like that. So what I would describe as perhaps lower work class. Most people in that area done that, or a trade. So you would either, a mechanic, a sparky, a chippy, or bricky, and stuff like that.
I mean, I'm kind of, I know I end up doing this all the time. Going off on one, but I'm interested in what you're talking about. How do you think then that impacted on your childhood, your upbringing, when you're going through school, and then you're looking to what's going to happen after school? How did the upbringing that you're starting to paint a picture about, how did that impact on your view on life, on what you ended up doing?
So this is interesting. So I've come across loads of people who are fairly affluent who use the word choice as if it's a realistic thing. Choice is
not for everyone.
You can only so you can only make choices about things that you know about and make sense about. Everything else is a bit of a risk, and there's nothing wrong with taking risks. But risks is something like if you're playing a game, you play a game, and you've got a reasonable chances of winning. You're more likely to enjoy it, etc., etc. So growing up in a community, there was only certain choices available to people like me, and that was made apparent through the schooling system. Where I was told to leave at 15 and a half because I wasn't going to pass anything. I was moved over to a different. I talk about my mates about this all the time. That the only A I ever got in school was in history because I loved history because my dad loved history, the World War II stuff. And then I got moved over to what they call the X section, which was for kids who were, were struggling a little bit with some academic subjects such as maths and French. And I never understood why people done French because the chances of meeting anybody French in Forth are probably minimal.
Unless they're a weaver.
Or Dundee. Well, this is it. So again, kind of world surrounded by what you know, that here and now, the yet to be thought is something else out there. So that world is just surrounded by the sort of norms and the expectations of what you're expected to do. And as we kind of mentioned briefly before, my mum just wanted me to get a good job. And the only restrictions that I had to that was my father saying, I don't want you working in the factory. So for me, and a lot of my mates leaving school at 15 and a half, they become, in those days, YTS schemes or youth training schemes, which are terribly paid, but were paid for partly by the oil that was discovered in the 70s and 80s. At least gave you, access to different professions. So every single one of my mates went in to do trades, every single one of them. And I was the only kid that I'm aware of in my scheme who went on to university, and that was later on. But everything that I know, everything you know about the world is made up of what's available to you.
The environment that you brought up in.
Because
what other lens have you got? I mean, nowadays, maybe it's slightly different.
Well, yeah, but the messages are still the same. They talk about social media and your access to these things. But we still had access to that in the 80s. The reason I went to America, or wanted to go to America, is because of 80s movies. Because I was watching things like The Karate Kid and stuff, and I'm thinking...
Was it the same as Karate Kid when you got there?
This is it. But I know, but you do. You're kind of like, oh, look at that, that's great. And that you kind of fantasize about the world, but it's still that risk, and it's still unusual for people to do these things from communities like that. But yeah, so that's why I'm drawn to youth community stuff, because actually communities are really, really important in people's lives and the way they're brought up and the way they talk, the way they act, and class and poverty and stuff.
Yeah,
no, but it is.
No, but I agree.
Yeah.
I'm holding back again because Dougie says sometimes just start rattling on.
All right. Okay.
No, for me to jump in and start, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds similar. There's similarities in what you were saying about upbringing, but one thing you did say that I thought was really interesting, and I found it as well. Growing up, it's like there was obviously things you may not have achieved everything you wanted to achieve at school for whatever reasons, a million different reasons. But there was obviously certain things that you did do well in, that you excelled in.
Yeah.
So why is it the education system doesn't then think, okay, well, why don't we actually really support them in that and put more weight on that instead of putting more weight on putting them in the X wing or the library or the you're not getting anything for this. You're not, like deficit of your crap, blah, 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 blah. But actually, there's real gold there. What's your thoughts?
Well, there's two things I think of this. Now, this was Dan McGarvey talked about this on
I
BBC
read
One.
his-
So he was talking about the private education system.
Yeah.
So my nieces and nephews on my wife's side are a lot of private school educated, and the resources that are given to them are vastly, vastly different than the resources that are given to state educated kids.
Right.
And state education is a lot more regulated in relation to what types of subjects people can do, the expectations, what we call accountability
Well, it's more
measures.
rigid, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, maths, English, ICT, which is hugely important, don't get me wrong, are the core focus for a lot of state education. Whereas whilst that's the same in private education, you've got lots of other things going on that capture kids' interests. So for example, for me, history. What I would have loved to do was maybe go to the World War I battlefields, in France and all these different things that kind of capture and really kind of mold that interest. And I still to this day would love to do, archaeology. I still love
You can.
that aspect. Exactly.
You can always
But there's
do
the
it.
goal. I know I can now. Because that's the choice that became.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a minute. And I think you find that quite a lot with working at class academics who come to academia quite late because the realization that they can do these things become quite late. But yeah, so you're absolutely right. So for me, it is a private education system or a well-resourced family can capture those interests and nurture those interests and care about those interests. Far less likely is under-resourced families or families who've got different priorities and different pressures and stuff like that. So again, my father was interested in World War II. That was the only books that we had around. So I kind of was that and Mills and Boone was the ones that my mum used to read.
I've heard of that. That's a bit old for me.
So again, that was mum. But again, that's the thing. So you have that what is around you, you kind of mold and shape your interests.
That
and your
environment
ideas
thing again, isn't it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And plus you were kind of feeding off what your mates were doing and who you've got access to, your neighbours, what they do for a living, what they're talking about, where they go on holiday and all these experiences. So it's those kinds of resources around you, again, that make an impact. And that's the difference. In state education, it's far more regulated. And you're told and you're kind of like, this is what you have to do as a...
I've got a question for you. So no. Everything you're saying is brilliant. I've got a question for you, and it's nothing to do with us. So we're going to definitely jump around a little bit. But I got this thing, like a lot of the people. So similar to you, I was like basically pushed out, not entered for certain exams, and basically just chucked in a flipping hole and just whatever. That's it. Yeah. You don't get an education. And then when I think back at other people that are in that same situation, most of them had different learning difficulties or different challenges or things that were going on at home and various other things. And I think now of my daughter, who I think is probably going to be dyslexic based on everything that she's showing at the moment. And it doesn't have to be the thing that stops.
No.
But then I'm only saying this because I'm thinking about this now.
No, it's good to think about it.
It's my own daughter. And I'm
it's good to think about it.
The trouble is, if you don't align with those core subjects like you're talking about, the rigidness of the curriculum that is in the UK, if you're not going to excel in English or maths, then you're probably going to struggle in a lot of those other rigid subjects. So you're probably going to then be put in to whatever they say, like the classes with more support, which generally will end up with other people with different learning difficulties or behaviour challenges and all the rest of it.
Yep.
Then you have to survive in those classes. Then you probably then just fit in, and then you don't get an education.
Yeah.
Not because of your talent with history or someone else's talent with dance or my talent. I don't know what my talent is, but do you know what I mean? Talent with all these different things. And we never really allow people that don't fit into that box. Does that happen at private school? Because I got a feeling that it's probably
it's about
not the same.
It's about optionality. It's about different pathways. I mean, I'm sure there are behaviours, and certainly when I was doing child safeguarding, I go to private schools and there was issues and concerns there. But you've got vast amount of resources there in comparison to state schools. And remember that all state schools are not the same, not dealing with the same challenges in disadvantaged communities. For example, you're much more likely to have concentrations of problems and issues and disadvantages. But there's different layers to this, and I'm going to give you two examples. One is teachers. So getting access to teachers who are inspirational, who are
and I had
have
a
the
couple
time
of
to
inspirational
invest.
ones. I don't want to do
Well, this is
anyone
it.
down.
It's the same. It's the
but
same.
I only had a couple I was allowed in.
Yeah, it's the same with sports coaches, same with youth workers. It's access to different people with different ideas of the world, have different impacts on you. Then, and this is when I went home a couple of weeks ago back to Dundee, and I had to get work done. I had to write an article writing about masculinity in class. And I'd go home and there's no space at all to sit and write. I remember having a couple of meetings and I was bent over the back of my bed because there was no table, there was no space for tables. Then my dad came in playing Elvis, and he's got the TV on, he's got, and I was in the kitchen, I'm like, what? Again, just there's the space available to become something different. Then you've got the pressures that you were talking about, your mates who may be not investing in that identity because they're investing in someone else. Then you've got other aspects that we talked about. So there's multiple levels going on there that kind of restrict, or what I would use, oppress the ability to become something.
What you want to become.
Yeah. Or your interests. So you might be interested in history, but most people wouldn't be necessarily interested in that.
And how would you look to your friends if you're like, well, that's my thing? You'd be worried about maybe, I don't know, I don't want to say too much.
No, but it's true.
But
it's true. I mean, there's again, it's that choice thing about what you could. I mean, again, football was the dominant in my community, and it still is, and it's so important. So if you want to be a tennis player,
you probably look down on, aren't you?
Well, you're going to mates, you want to have a game of tennis. What? First of all, you've got to find tennis rackets. Second of all, you've got to find a court that's not been turned into flats.
Yeah.
Or
used for people.
Well, this is it. So there's a perfect example of your interest in tennis. So you've got to then leave or go and, travel to a different area and meet different people, and, it becomes a little bit more challenging whereas you talk about private schools, and I live not too far from one, vast areas of land where there's tennis courts, there's golf course on the school. I mean, can you imagine that in most of the schools? So again, it's that level of choice. It's that level of resources and capturing different interests I find interesting.
And I suppose the thing for me is that how could that be rolled out in a way that may mean that there's slightly less for those with more, but a bit more with those with less, and equal that out? I mean,
well, these are very challenging conversations to have when you're living in a society that's neoliberal. It's capitalist, where the assumption is that there will always be poverty and poor people.
Does there need to be poor people for there to be affluation?
Yeah. I'm going to be slightly saying that I think that is a political choice in a lot of ways. Because certainly when I grew up, poverty was prevalent, but it was less obvious in the sense that, there was families who had less clothes in the tenements and stuff. And, you could tell people could afford Christmas presents if you celebrate Christmas. But it was, everybody still had jackets on and shoes on and could eat, and there was free school lunches, and there was all these different things, where now it's stigmatized. And I can see, or I've known of kids who literally they'd be wearing the same clothes day in, day out, and I think that's it. So the poverty levels have kind of increased, and it's become more obvious, as is the stigma attached to poverty. Whereas growing up in the tenements, people were kind of, we're poor, but we didn't really know.
Was there more? I mean, actually, let's not go there. I could keep going, and I'm really interested to keep going with that. But maybe that's one I'll pick up with you another time.
Yeah, it's fine.
But it's kind of connected, I think. So, like, you spoke about when you were younger about the sense of community.
Yeah.
What kind of things were you doing in your community then when you were growing up? How did that help shape what may have happened as you got older? Yeah.
So, I mean, again, it's that we talked about resources. So, I walked in here today, and in the middle of a community is a centre, a space where you can go and you've got different options and meet different people and things like that. So the resources, there were buildings, youth clubs, there were social clubs, there was football clubs, there was fields to play football and do all these different interests. But also it's the people and the connections you had with people, or the relationships you had with different people. So you knew people in your community, and you knew people who were revered in your community. You knew people who you could go to and trust and ask for advice, or people knew somebody who could do that. And those sort of networks were a lot more close knit in what we call as academic social capital. So you trusted people, I mean, it's unimaginable now that you would let your kid leave for 12 hours and not know where they are. But
Holidays, get out.
well, this is it. So you knew the spaces that were accessible. You knew the people. You knew the police officers.
Yeah.
So we knew who the police were. They knew who we were. Those communities were less mobile in a sense. But we also had different people in those communities too. So it wasn't as separated as it is now. Because if you can afford, you leave a community. And that's partly problematic. So the whole system of leaving to a better community or choosing different schools based on where you live,
it's a social conditioning
concentrates
kind of thing,
that.
Because you've got people that will leave that might be of a certain kind of whatever. I don't know.
Yeah. So again, it's interesting. So the primary school I went to were in a catchment area where we had some rich kids and then we had us. So the Goose Growth kids. And looking back now, we were treated as obviously around sort of poverty and class. But we still had access to different people. So I was still going to homes where I'm thinking, oh, there's something different going on here. You know, they've got a car or their ability to drive. So
But they've got a house.
Yeah. And that's the things like
Do you know what I mean?
football. Football gives you, or rugby gives you. Again, you're meeting different kinds of people with different attitudes and different outlooks on life.
Which is good. Do you not think that? I again, this is not about me, but I definitely. So I grew up in born in Bristol, but grew up in Yatton for most of my, which is like just it's on the edges of Bristol. And I think the gold for me was growing up with loads of people that were middle class that had these different opportunities, these different things. And all right, we lived on a council estate and we didn't have much, but I was surrounded by other people. So certain things that might not have become normal had I been just in a bigger estate in Bristol, maybe, become a bit more normalised for me, because as much as I know I didn't have anything, I was still seeing what other people could have. And then I was sat in class with them and talking about this, that, and the other, and I could realise that I've got just as much to offer as other people. Do you know what I mean? And it suddenly it cuts away a little bit from us and them kind of situation.
So again, access to things. So I like the word stigma because it's understandable, the stereotypes and things like that. So the stereotypes of certain communities have shifted now as well. So when I grew up, coming from certain communities was less stigmatized. So for example, working class was associated with working hard. That you knew that if somebody was working class, that they were a hard worker, which is still the case now. But now we don't associate with that. So access to services, and I'll give you a perfect example. So I worked extensively with young people for many, many years. And what I noticed, there were certain shifts that I noticed, that the young people were entitled to benefits, but they don't want to claim benefits because the benefits are stigmatized.
Yeah.
Where benefits, were still kind of seen as that person's on benefits, whatever, but you still had access to them. And now it's kind of like you're bad if you claim benefits. So all of these sort of narratives have shifted, or what discourses, what we tell, the stories we tell about ourselves. So young people who have access, or should have access to certain support systems, they only see as relevant to themselves in certain ways. So benefits being one perfect example. So again, the amount of young people, I'm like, look, come on, I'll come with you to the job centre. And even that's a huge ordeal. The lack of privacy in these spaces.
And it's pride, isn't it? Like
big time.
It's massively about pride and how you're seen by others. And funnily enough, I suspect there's a lot of people that we all would have known and grown up with that are signing on and claiming different benefits, probably more openly doing that when they are earning money in other ways as well. Yeah. So there's not the stigma. Yeah. Do you see what I mean?
And sticking to certain professions and what you're doing, is really, really important. So people look down on if they do certain roles or they're not buying certain things or doing certain things. And these pressures can be quite acute in certain communities.
God, I really could dig into this. I mean, but it's like, how do you identify? And people generally, what's the first question someone asks? Oh, so what do you do?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, you get first question, like, what do you do? So if people identify with what they do, if your response is, and nothing wrong with, being a cleaner, being a scaffolder, and all that, jobs that are needed. But if you're kind of more kind of like wary of saying what you do because it's someone that you think might be more kind of affluent that's asking that question, and suddenly you don't have pride in what you're doing, and you kind of you shrink down. And how do we change that? Do you know what I mean?
Well, again, it's interesting because the other thing I was thinking about when you asked the question about what resources in communities is the ability of workers to be themselves.
Yeah, to feel confident and comfortable in themselves.
Yeah. So professionalization is hugely important, but actually being yourself and being part of the culture that you were raised in is huge because it allows you to associate with different people. So I used to work with people in Glasgow who were brilliant. I mean, one perfect example was I was working with a sports coach in an area of Glasgow. I can't quite remember, but it was getting dark and it was about 8 o'clock at night. And I think, this is going to kick off here. Something's going to happen. It was fine. 200 kids, maybe I'm exaggerating, came through the bushes, and he was like the Pied Piper, but he was cussing and swearing, and but the kids loved him, adored him, because he was one of them,
Exactly.
But he was still a trustworthy, loyal person. He was like being Ofsted nightmare now in school. But he was a character. He was somebody who was revered, or a different kind of working class hero, if you want to put it that way. So now the narrative of working class hero has changed. It's somebody who's got, renting out 5 or 6 houses and has done well for themselves economically, rather than being somebody who's kind of still the same.
And gives back.
Yeah, exactly. So all of these sort of ideas, but you still had those characters who are maybe looked down upon now, and or maybe choosing to do something else because.
Well, are they there? I mean, we're going to definitely going to drive into that in a second. I suppose the last thing about, like, when you're growing up, do you feel like you had your voice heard?
No, and I just wrote about that actually.
Come on then.
And
Let's
it's
have a little bit of a short kind of insight.
The word "feel" there is different than the word "did you."
Yeah.
So I may feel that I've done surveys. I may feel that somebody's came in and talked to us, but I can't in any way, shape, or that remember it. But the more I look back on it, not at all. I mean, yeah.
Do you think that impacts on you at all growing up? I mean, what's your? You can only talk personally, can't you? I know you can talk academically, but
No, I think again that's the idea of oppression or segregation and separation from the control over your life. Like state education, we talked about that. Like, what choice do you have if you're state educated? If somebody's telling you what you have to do in relation to your subjects or your interests, and those sorts of pathways are becoming restricted, and taken away. So there you go. So I remember saying that I love history. I got an A in it. It's the only one I got. Happy to show you my grades. Stunning. But I was still told, well, because you don't do French or English, you have to then go to this one. And I see it repeatedly with the kids that I used to work with. And for me, advocacy, so advocating for those kids, fighting for those kids, saying, look, this
celebrating what they're blooming good at.
I'll give you a perfect example of this. So I've sat in hundreds of children in need meetings, which is, in children's safeguarding. And we talk a lot about children's rights. We talk about legal rights. I can honestly say that little box on that form that says, what does the young person say? It says either two things. It says nothing at all and left blank, or F off. Because again, there's a difference between asking someone and asking someone after you get to know them and care about them and understand what's going on around. Because what they may say, to an interview or to somebody asked these certain things is different once you get to know someone. 100% different. And again, that's why I used to work with kids and try to get them into those meetings, because suddenly the power dynamics change when you've got a young person who's actually in there in that scenario.
And it's the relationship-centered point, isn't it? Why would you respond in another way if you think that whoever's asking you is connected with the negativity that's happening in your life compared to someone that supported you? Right, now let's get into what's been your working history, because we've touched on a few things.
You've only got an hour, right?
But take us on a little journey. You left school. What did you get into, and then how did you end up working with young people, and in what different ways?
So I left school. I played football professionally for 2 or 3 years, which was great because I was meeting again different kinds of people with different attitudes and real dedicated professionals and whatever else, but also would give you advice. And one of those people said, or 2 or 3 people said to me, look, do a college course at the same time, which I then led me to an FE college, what we call Higher National Certificate, which then allowed me to go to university. And university was not something I aspired to straight away. It was more people were kind of then mentioning it, because a lot of the footballers were coming to the end of their careers and wondering what they were doing. So they were like, well, what am I going to do? So they would start to do university courses, and those conversations were starting to be had. And they then linked me up with a college course, a sports course, at a place called Jordan Hill College, which no longer exists. It's now Fancy Flats. But it's under Strathclyde University. So, yeah, and I was still very unsure what university it was. It was that kind of, well, I'll still do it because it's given me a chance to get out of here. But I was doing a sports course there, and I remember, similar to what I was saying earlier, what I found really interesting was that I went from being the kid who was playing football, or the working class kid playing football, to the guy who
doing
was,
well playing football as well. That
Oh,
must have
yeah.
added to your identity, professional contract. Do you know what I mean? That must have.
I remember like being vividly conscious of the fact that I was no longer that kid. I was the one who was coaching these kids. And their behaviours and the way they were acting were very similar to the way that we used to act in school, you know, and I could read it very well. I could read those and I could engage with that. And so I was far more interested in the kids than I was in sport and all that. Sport was just a pathway that I was good at. So then after that, I thought, well, I can't go back to Dundee. There's nothing to go back to Dundee for. I wasn't in a trade or nothing like that. So I went to America through sport again, through football, and got a coaching thing going on there. And I stayed there for 7 years, but I kind of got a job in an adolescent psych unit.
Whereabouts in America?
So in New York. So
You're a dark horse,
place
aren't
called
you?
Long Island. Yeah. So you said that. You opened a horse there. So I worked in Queens with disabled kids, and I worked in an adolescent psych unit in Long Island.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So again, that cemented it. And then I moved back to London. I got married, moved back to London, and I worked in East London, in Newham, just near Tower Hamlets, in FE College. With alternate provision, which is for excluded kids and whatever else. So I was then intrigued by the fact that the way these kids were not listened to, sort of running around the college because the teachers weren't turned up. So then that gave me a chance to do a master's, and I was lucky enough to work with somebody called Simon Bradford, who's a professor, and he encouraged me to do a PhD, which again, I didn't understand what a PhD was. I had no idea. Sounds bizarre, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I had no idea what it was. And it just seemed like well, that sounds good. I can continue to study. But I was still working full-time as a youth worker at this particular time. So I just worked for 16 years in children's safeguarding, youth work, youth justice, youth offending work, loads of different things around kids, but always maintained a caseload of young people, even though I'd done sort of different management positions. So I was always really, I want to be working with these kids. If I'm going to be making judgments about them, I want to be working with them too. So for the last 25 years, I've done that. And then I got into higher education.
I mean, that sounds is a really interesting journey that you've been on. And what really stands out to me when you say about all this is that from a position of not really knowing what you wanted to do and not really understanding like what you got to give, and maybe school didn't work out for you in the way that maybe some people would hope that's the norm. Your thirst for learning has been huge through everything that you've said, like that constant kind of learning of different things or aspects that are connected to young people and supporting young people and, you know, excelling as well through further education. How do you feel like, is there certain catalysts that have allowed you to do that? Because I think this is something maybe that, and there's something in this, isn't there? What made you feel like you could do that?
So again, it goes, for me, I've always been like this. I've always been like, if I'm interested in something, I'll get into it. And the history was that. To this day, I'm still interested in these things. But it's weird. It's kind of, you're given access to different spaces. So I remember going to Dundee College and meeting different people, but it was that ability to go to a library and sit in a library. And I remember I just went back to that actually, when I went back to Dundee to take a picture, and it's still there of the desk I used to sit. But it just made sense. Yeah. I just liked it. I liked sitting and reading and finding out about stuff. And then the more things that you find about around sports, for example, I thought, well, this is really interesting.
That sounds like your gateway. Do you know what I mean? Like
I was always, but this is the thing, and this is the misconception I think about a lot of working class young men in particular, is that they don't have these interests, or that they're just all the same. And actually, you know, all of my mates, and I say this sparingly, all of my mates who were asked to leave school or pushed out of school, excluded from school, half of them are successful now. They're plumbers, they're sparkies, they've got their own businesses. The other half are dead. Drugs, alcohol, stuff like that. So again, what would have happened to these other kids if you'd given them different times and spaces and resources? But I remember sitting in the class and having conversations with mates around me. The misconceptions that go around about what young working class men in particular, and women, is hugely significant. Because again, I always had these interests. It's just that nobody really gave me the space and the time and the interest to do that. And I find that across the board with young people that I work with.
And it's still the case now, isn't it? Let's be honest. It is still the case now. It's either that you don't feel like you can open up and be honest about those things, what they are, because it might not kind of sit too well in the friendship groups that you've got. You might be looked at as a whatever that word might be. Or it might be that you don't feel like the opportunity is there and you haven't got the support to kind of, or the catalyst to make it happen. I mean, it's super interesting to have a professional sport, football contract. And then at 21, like you were talking about people that were retiring.
Yeah.
For you to have that hindsight, or not hindsight, foresight to think, I'm going to go and do a degree in this, that. That blows my mind, because most people that that have grown up loving football and then get to that position would be like, this is my life. Do you know what I mean? I dreamt of this. What happened to make you think, no, but I want someone else?
But this again, it's so I remember there was there's a guy called, used to play Spanish League Division 1, La Liga. He was an ex-Irish international, a guy called Alan Campbell, still lives in Dundee. I had that conversation with him. He played against Barcelona and all these different things. So he introduced to people who are thinking about the world differently, or thinking about, okay, what do I do now? And actually having conversations with people that you respect, you have loyalty for, really changes your narrative about how you see the world and what you want from the world. But again, you've still got to have the opportunity to do that. So football for me will allow that right across the board. So I was good at football. In school, it was the PE teacher and the art teacher who stuck up for me when I was asked to leave school. So those two people were like, well, Craig's got something to offer.
That was your identity, I guess.
Well, this is it. Yeah. And again, the identity word, we just talked about that. So an academic identity was so far removed. Well,
I'm sure
I didn't have a space to become an academic. But again, and this is the whole thing, I've co-founded an organization called the Working Class Academics, because being a working class academic is a bit of a, like, the two don't go together. Really, apparently. Like, you're working class, though, or were you working class? So now you're an academic, so you can't be working class. And
that's it. This is an argument now.
See, there we go. There's a perfect thing. So if you come from a working class community, the expectations are that you're not going to be an academic. I mean, that's the whole thing. So that just kind of vividly explains, the pressures, even though I'm at my young age now of 50, I can still understand the pressures that young people are facing, and amongst other things like social media and the images and the messages they're getting from other people. So yeah, the pressures are still there. And that's what I found really interesting when I was doing my PhD, and I was drawn to what I called the bad boys. I was sat with them for a year, and they were still having the same conversations that I was having 25 years prior with my mates about the expectations of life and what the choices that are available. And they were it felt like they were a bit on a train journey rather than a car journey. They kind of knew where they were heading vaguely, rather than having lots of different pathways and taking different journeys and adventures and different things. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. I just got so many questions I want to ask you. I don't know, I can fit it all in. I mean, so can you still, this is something I kind of grapple with. Can you still be working class if you've then gone on, done a degree, got a house? Do you know what I mean? All the things that you never thought that you'd aspire to.
Yeah.
We were chatting earlier on about, like, I don't know how old I was when I had an olive for the first time. I was like, what the hell's that? When someone, and just like all these like little things which are normal now. Yeah. But then you find yourself in that situation. Can you be?
Oh, 100%. Oh, I am still. I mean, put it this way. Am I Scottish?
Well, I think the viewers might be able to tell.
Yeah.
We're putting subtitles on.
So I haven't lived in Scotland for 25 years. Yeah. My accent has changed beyond recognition. In fact, if people
you sound Scottish, right, to us, obviously. But do you sound as localised when you go out?
No. I mean, it's a completely different dialect. It's a way of speaking. It's understood. There you go. There's a perfect example. Right?
But are you looked at in your community when you go home, like if it's the tenements or wherever it might be? Are people thinking, aye, Billy Big Spuds, he's nipped off and done this and done that?
Well, there you go.
He ain't one of us. I mean, I don't know.
So there's the tensions. There's lots of unpick there. And that's the whole thing about working class academics and discussions that we have. So you wouldn't question my Scottishness. You know I'm Scottish. I haven't lived in Scotland for 25 years, right? I haven't lived in a working class community, the tenements and whatever else for 20 odd years. I've worked, however, up until 2016, 17 in working class communities, in homes, and doing children's safeguarding and all that sort of stuff. But this thing is still there, that you still wouldn't question that. But yet people question the fact that for 25 years I grew up as working class, but now I'm not. So all the values, all the things you believe, all the way you were treated somehow doesn't matter anymore. Also, I worked in a factory. I worked in a canning factory. I worked in, picking berries since I was 5, 6 years old, picking tatties. All of these things that are working class are still hugely important to me and who I am, but also the precarious aspect of it, of like thinking, wait a minute, this could end. This could end soon, and I might have to go back and do exactly, because I know it's a known quantity. And I don't have the resources to sustain myself till I get a next contract and stuff like that. So you're still it. But of course, as you say, there's elements where you think, okay, so I now like couscous. So therefore, am I
That's another one.
Am I middle class?
That's another olive moment, isn't it?
But you're still treated that way. So, I live in a community now that's relatively well off, and I go to the pub and I'm called the lager drinker. Or my neighbours cheekily call me the professor. So it's interesting. I still treated differently because I do a certain profession and it doesn't seem to fit together. But as you say, what's important to me is who can speak for working class people. So am I in a position now where I can speak for working class people? And that's the importance of voice. My job, and the importance I think as an academic, is to raise those voices, because I've now reached a position where people listen to you. The fact I'm sitting here still blows my mind. Because
really?
again, because
I would say the same.
because again, I mean, this is exactly it. So as a youth worker, I knew more about what was going on in the community 10 years ago, but no one listened to you. But now, because I'm an academic, people, it's that kudos and that power and stuff like that. So I feel it, I still have that loyalty to the community. So I still want to raise those voices and raise the concerns that people in working class communities are still oppressed. So for me, those are working class traits that you don't forget about where you come from. But as you say, there's tensions there all the way through this. So I can't go home and talk about what I do because nobody knows what I do. So when I go, if I see my mates, for example, they're proud of me, but they don't know what I do. Like they'll talk about 4x2 or getting a bit of plaster in or using the wrong material. Or perfect example. So when I graduated, all the people in my PhD office, which I kind of knew and didn't know because I came in and out because I was part-time, all put on my Facebook status, "Oh, well done, Dr. Craig." I deleted it all. Because I didn't want my mates or anybody going from home going, "Who do you think he is?"
Why?
Well, exactly. But because again, it's that tension that in working class communities is an academic norm. It's that relationship to education. So education is still, for a lot of people, something you get through. It's not something that you aspire to, in a sense. Although some working class communities, and this is the beauty of discussion of class, is there are working class families who invest in education, whose family invest in education, 100%. Yeah. And that's the misunderstanding.
And it's normally immigrant families.
Well, this is it. And there's a diversity within class. And that's the beauty of discussions of class. It's not just one monolithic thing that moves along. It affects people in different ways. And again, the intersection of race, for example, or culture or ethnicity, it's hugely important. And that's why the concern around white working class men about their trajectory into higher education. However, going into being a plumber and a sparky and stuff, it's still, my mates are
massively needed.
My mates are, as far as I'm aware, doing much better than me financially because, but in the same token, they've not left Forth and Dundee a lot of the times. They went on holiday and do these different things, but they still live in the community that they grew up in. So, you can understand the risk taking there that we were talking about earlier about taking a journey that you don't really understand. So I talk about making it up. So all the time I'm making it up because I don't know what's next. I don't know how the game works in a way.
But you're making up your own game.
Well, this is it. Or should you stop playing the game altogether? Should there be a game at all that if it's already plagued against you? So you can understand how again, there's a purpose. So when we work with young people, you can it's that relating it to yourself and the way that you've kind of moved trajectories makes sense to the young people too. And that's why it's important to have those discussions.
So, I mean, I want to meet up with you another time and go through it because I'm massively interested in it and I've got so much to ask, but I can't fit it in. But I mean, it's something. It's an inside. It's an inside-out job, isn't it? It's how you feel inside, and then it's how you're perceived outside. But you're fully aware of both things, and how that can impact on you is obviously pretty huge.
But isn't that good though with young people? I tell you, so when I was a youth worker, I remember studying and looking at this, and this is the brilliant of doing this part time.
They'd only be aware of it potentially if they're being supported with people that have maybe walked that walk. But those people don't necessarily exist.
You can have those conversations. Because young people are aware too, particularly of young people who perhaps have got middle class relatives and working class relatives. They're aware of it. They're aware of those dynamics. But that's the thing. You can have conversations, even if it's not directly about class. You don't want to force aspects of things that they don't want to talk about. But the fact that you're aware of it allows you to then kind of use that to leverage different opportunities. So one of the things I kind of came out of my research, what I was doing was this cultural intermediary, where you're an intermediary or a go-between between different cultures and jobs and not jobs, and what's possible and what's not possible, and choices and stuff like that. And that's why it's important, I think, for people to go to university and be aware of these different dynamics. Because when you work with people, you've got to understand the cultures, the norms and stuff like that they come from, that they understand.
And I agree with that. And I suppose, and I'm not going to go on about it particularly for any point, but there's that step before. And I know that's how we started talking about gap and other things. So there's that step before, isn't there?
Yeah, 100%.
That with that relationship with those young people that you built over time, all the rest of it, they turn up because they want to turn up. And then you support them to work towards things that matter to them, those opportunities that matter to them that may not have been perceived as actually realistic, but it is what matters to them. And just by even feeling like they can try, and it might not work out, is more of a benefit than just feeling like they have to do something. How many of your mates that are plumbers, chippies, blah, 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 and we could all say different things, they've done well, brilliant.
Yeah.
Would that have been the thing that they would have gone for at that moment if they did have that support at that time to...
Well, we've had those discussions. I've had mates, because I went to university, I used to take what we call in Scotland pelters. Or
what?
Exactly.
You might have
so
to. This might be
Scotland,
a moment to explain.
It's basically like you're getting grief. Somebody's giving you a hard time, so we call it you're taking pellets.
Right. Okay.
Or you've been pelted with stuff. Is pelted the word?
I don't know. That sounds like a Scottish thing.
Pellets, yeah. So you take pellets. So, but again, the fact that I went to university, it doesn't mean that my other mates. I've had mates who have went to university after to be quantity surveyors and all that sort of stuff. But the fact that I done it. And they become aware of it. Maybe there's less stigmatized around it as well because we're having those conversations. But going back to what you were saying, so there's a lot of talk about relationship, and I like the word relationship, but I think it also, I think it needs to be changed a little bit to make connection so we can have different conversations. So that you're making a connection with young people. So for me, depending on the types of job that you do, so for a social worker, the word connection is hugely relevant because at some point, you may need to say, I need to stop this now because the support I'm giving you isn't appropriate for the level. So people it takes that personalization away from it.
And they might have to make decisions that
and I used to say that all the time.
Absolutely be catastrophic.
So a lot of social workers and people who are in statutory roles kind of understand this relationship, and I don't like that. And it also forces you to make connections. Like, what have you got in common with that young person in front of you? Or what you don't have in common, or what did they have that you can have in common? Because it's your job to find that connection. And for me, that was the beauty of the journey with the young person, was finding out what they were interested in. I remember one young person who, a nightmare to get a hold of. I went around his house consistently. And then one day I thought, right, I'm passing, so I'm going to pop in. I went to the back garden, and here he is fixing a bike.
Bingo!
I'm like,
he likes bikes. Bike mechanics, you're in.
I'm in. Literally, within 6 months, he's doing a mechanics course. And I'm thinking I couldn't get hold of him for 6 months. I just turned up one day. Next thing you know, we're talking about that because, using I love cars too, because that was partly your age. You're working class kids, we like our cars and stuff. I was talking about Volkswagens. I was talking about this. If you've done this, I would then take them to the different stores to look at rims or wheels. Just by that, I had another kid who was a nightmare as well to get hold of, fishing.
Yeah, that's an absolute
night fishing.
Age-old classic.
Night fishing. I don't understand it. I wrote about it recently about night fishing. Kids like night fishing.
Depends what group you're working with.
Yeah. They'll sit for hours just trying to catch something. But again, that's it. And that's that connection. And I can honestly say, and I don't mean to, but I've worked with thousands of kids in different countries, thousands of kids. I can count my hand, and I know the names of them, who I found it extremely hard to build that connection, either because they've chosen me not to engage with, like you're the person I'm not going to talk to, or there was other stuff going on there. But even if a kid's in an adolescent psych unit, even if a kid's, working class kid, even if a kid, and I've worked with people at Eton and, all these things as well, they're still kids.
Yeah.
You still have to find that connection. Usually, and I say this jokingly, I have never worked with a kid who doesn't want to talk about the trainers.
Yeah, that's it. On detached, that is absolute gold, isn't it?
I like your trainers, where you get trainers from. How much do they trainers cost? Both. Instantly, it takes away the pressure of that kind of trying to, and you've made a connection. And then, as you get a little older, whatever, you can't stop with trainers, so you kind of make fun of yourself a little bit, going, oh, not in my day. My day, it'd be Nike divisions or, that sort of stuff. But then you're starting to build that type of relationship. But it is, and this is what I tried to say to youth workers, sports coaches, all these different things. It's your job, that's your role, is to somehow make a connection with the people that you're working with.
What I'd like to say, because all those different things that you just said then, again, there's more to pick into with that, but it's, obviously with the space of time, but you've obviously been doing this work in different professions, but keeping a core value of how you are supporting and engaging young people.
Yep.
How do you feel like that has changed over the last 20 years? Can you kind of talk us through like what the positives and the things that can be improved, the challenges?
I think there's been improvements in terms of professionalizations of, accountability for certain things, because obviously we've known for various years that you need to be accountable for the things that you're doing. And again, that could be really positive. But on the negative side, I think the freedom, has been lost. The ability to work with people for however long they need to be worked with. And I use the word need sparingly because, there's power dynamics there. But also it's the types of services. So, for example, when I first came back to London 20 years ago, youth work still existed. So, for example, youth work isn't what it is now. Youth work used to be a political thing. It used to be, what do you want to do and how does this affect your life? Again, that yet to be thought conversation of trying to connect who you are in the community and your position in the community to other things that are going on in the world. That's what good youth work is. Trust, that the spaces. We walked in here today and it was brilliant. It reminded me of youth clubs that I used to work in. There's a poster downstairs with the kids and that we used to do projects like that. And then suddenly the kids would be connected with graffiti groups and, understanding the impact of tagging and the impact on communities and whatever else. All of those abilities have sort of disappeared, particularly since 2010, where only certain professions were given a status and allowed to exist. And other ones had to survive. So they were starting to take on different aspects of what necessarily isn't a profession. So I've found youth work now is quite targeted, which does work in certain contexts, but isn't youth work at all. There was a report.
Explain that a bit more, because I understand what you're saying. But
So give it a perfect example. There was a report come out this morning, and I'm not going to criticise it, but the report came out this morning that said it was about violence. And it was saying there's been a 50% reduction in services for youth work. The youth work has lost its funding by 50%. Then the solution was mentoring. And I'm thinking to myself, is mentoring the same as youth work? So you've got rid of an entire profession, an established profession from the 50s and 60s, and a lot longer, that had a real ideological understanding of who young people are. And then you've changed it into a mentoring. You've literally changed the profession into something completely different that fits a completely different narrative.
Well, so one-to-one work,
which don't get me wrong, but again, it then
not
becomes
youth work.
Yeah, so it becomes, and this is I'm going to be slightly controversial here, but it becomes a psychological framing. So the way you understand the young people's issues have been turned into something else. Does that make sense? Rather than being a social, cultural, and psychological, you've made it one thing. And the only thing that these short-term interventions can make sense in schools, for example, youth work going into schools, is to see it through those framings. And that's problematic because you're detaching young people from bigger problems or structural issues or those pathways that we talked about before that you'd be denying. And I think that's really interesting conversations to have with young people. And that's partly problematic of what's happening with a lot of professions now. The resources are not there. You're changing professions to make it something that it never used to be. It was never set up to be. And also you've lost the resources in communities that allow you to work with different people as well.
So if I was someone, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, and if I was someone that was listening to this that isn't involved in youth work or youth sector, or wasn't involved in youth work years ago, when I suppose to explain it in a real basic way, the centres were there, the youth workers had time to be in that place, planning other sessions and different things that are happening, but they had time. So young people might come in off the street. It's not a session planned. There's nothing, but they're there for them. They're there to go and support them to do this, to do that, to think about this, to be challenged on that. Whatever those things might be, but those young people choose to turn up because of the relationship.
Voluntary.
And the impact that has, and that's an intervention as well. Because I think that some of the things that happen now, with especially one-to-one mentoring with the police, well, not with the police, but like connected with criminality, with young people involved in serious or violent crime, and that one-to-one work, that the whole thought process, that the only thing that's going to support them because they're so far down the line is that one-to-one work, is so short-sighted, because that costs an absolute fortune. There's youth workers and youth work organisations that are doing it. It makes people a lot of money, which may support the other work that needs to be done. I'm not digging it out. But surely if there was that work that happened 5, 6, 7 years before that was open to all, that socialised those young people in a setting that they felt part of, where they felt valued, they belonged to, they heard all these kind of things, then I'm not saying it wouldn't come to that, and there's not a place for that. But what's the impact now then of not having those universal youth workers that do that work?
Yeah.
Like,
and it's interesting because people might be listening and think, "Oh, Craig, you're thinking of it," and this is the danger of being an academic and yourself. People say, "Oh, it wasn't wonderful back in the 70s." Of course, it wasn't.
No.
But it was about options. It was about choices. It was about people. It was about different services available for different people. And I say this with sport. In order to survive, sport are taking short-term interventions, sport clubs, which might work and might not work. But again, it's the availability of services. And it's not just sort of put down into one understanding of a young person's issues or problems or whatever else. And again, that takes away the pathways and understandings of the world that young people should be exposed to. And again, as I say, I grew up in a community that had its problems. And there was youth clubs and stuff, and we just didn't go to youth club because it wasn't cool or whatever else.
Or whoever was running it wouldn't let you in.
But we still had options, and it's, again, we were still good kids in a way. There was one or two that went to jail and whatever. Don't get me wrong. But the vast majority were kids who just wanted to be listened to, wanted to be heard, and appreciated those relationships with the police. I mean, the police is a perfect example. The police kind of knew us and knew where we were hanging out. The teachers stayed consistent. We knew the teachers and the generational thing. So those levels of stability were there. Now it's kind of like you don't know what services are going to be available in 6 months' time. The referrals to those services. So your very successful work is really key because, again, you're reliant on people knowing it exists. And it's consistently, and people can access it and things like that. So, yeah, for me, it isn't this glamorous life that existed because we know youth violence is actually going down. But that's partly because young people are not going out as much and interacting in the way we record it.
And that will have a knock-on effect on them.
Yeah, but I would also argue that it's probably increased online, and I see it online. I used to deal with quite a lot of children safeguarding, the bullying and all these sort of different things. But yeah, so for me, it's kind of just having optionality, having different choices, meeting different people in your life, which is kind of really important to young people generally, as well as to everybody in the community.
And would that be, without putting words into your mouth, would that be the thing that needs to change potentially to improve the offer for young people in this modern day? Or is there other things that you think?
No, I mean, first and foremost, the young people need to be involved in this conversation. Because again, I have no idea. My understanding of social media stopped at the WhatsApp. What's that, Snapchat? I remember sitting in a car. I remember sitting in a car with a young person and they were taking pictures of themselves. Like, what are you doing? No, Snapchat. I'm like, oh, that's me out. But again,
You're probably in it.
young people need to be involved in this conversation, but also people who work with young people need to be involved in the occasion to understand what they're saying. And also it needs to be people who are power brokers need to understand that it might be that some resources need to be diverted away from other things, other interests, to give young people those spaces. So those are difficult conversations.
To value those spaces enough, society to value them enough for it to be an offer to young people, because so those conversations can happen.
Well, I mean, again, it's the classic thing with youth work, and I'm not harping on youth work. I say only youth work because obviously that's a core part of what my skill set. But again, this image of a youth worker playing pool with a kid, and then people going, "Oh, what are they doing?"
Building relationships.
Do you understand the levels of stuff that are going on in that conversation with good youth work? And I'm sure that I've seen examples of not good youth work.
Yeah.
But the levels of stuff that are going on and just around that pool table or sitting down having a conversation with someone, you know, the levels of stuff that's going on. And again, relate it to your own life, where some really quite interesting and deep conversations that you've had with other people growing up. The things that impact, and that's that level of reflection or reflexivity or whatever we talk about in academia. It's just think back, theorize using your own life experiences of how important those moments were in your life. To take away those moments or to kind of put them into compartments.
They create crossroads, don't they? Like, I mean,
the pathways,
all those things, and without those different moments, you don't then get an insight and, you know, a catalyst to potential positive change. And people that might want to make things more kind of technical and like talking about how you might play pool and great, you know, even that thing, just like the simple thing to say, like if people are going to go and see a counsellor, do you know what I mean? They're not going to sit there and look at them like that. There's going to be a 45-degree angle. There's going to be all these things that are making it less kind of, full on for that young person to talk about these things. You're doing something else. It's just a deterrent.
And and here's a perfect example. The last thing, well, I'll say two last things if I could, but one is my initial training was in psychology. Adolescents, like brilliant. I've seen brilliant work in psychology, like boof. You know, that I would love to be able to do that with a group of young people and the emotions that are going on. But I also kind of thought psychology isn't for me. You know, I kind of other stuff going on here that why am I seeing the same young people coming in this door? You know, why they come from certain. It was really interesting. So the optionality to think about the world differently. So if you can see in academia that those subjects are starting to disappear. So sociology has been criticized. You know, again, our understanding has become narrow. Then there's a conversation about what works. I'm going to say this, it's going to be fairly cool. We know what works. I hate these, we do an amount of reports and we know what works. Humanistic values. It isn't, you know, Carl Rogers was talking about this, and it applies to psychology as it does detached youth work.
Yep.
You care about someone, you show you care about someone, they will normally give that, they will reciprocate that. They will go, well, this person cares about me, so therefore I'm more likely to care about them. And I have seen this work in higher education lecture rooms, and I've seen it in detached work in very extreme circumstances. And I say extreme circumstances where someone's likely to do something for you or turn up for you because you're a human and you're treating them like a human. Of course, this doesn't work right across the board when you've got other issues going on, do not get me wrong, with mental health concerns and all that sort of stuff. But across the board, I hate different reports that regurgitate the same thing.
Why aren't we acting
just
on
using
it?
A different
Widespread?
Yeah, again, it's that humanistic element that we're kind of losing in a lot of things that existed in other professions, and the ability and time to develop those connections or relationships are hugely important. So it's not rocket science, and we need to just focus on professions and people and invest in those people and professions that do that. I think that if I could see that by the time maybe 20 years time when I retire or whatever else, I'll be a happy person. But we just kind of narrowing our understanding of these problems and individualizing it, which fits into a particular view of the world, which we need to kind of pull back a little bit.
It makes it easier for people, but it doesn't make it solve the situation. And it sounds like we got some of the answers, not all.
And again, I can't emphasize enough how this is interesting. So when you become an academic, people go, well, you don't know what's going on in the real world. So I'm going to challenge that and say I spent 25 years working in communities which was racially different, religiously different, East London to the Bronx and Queens in New York, for example, kids are still kids. Young people are still young people. How you relate or connect with those young people is still the same. The same skill set that I saw in the guy in the sports coach in Glasgow is still the same skill set that's still useful across different professions. And the best professional I've seen have understood that. That core value base is used profession. Will allow you to connect with young people across different spaces and places.
Now we just need the opportunity to create a workforce that has all those values.
Or it used to exist, let's invest in it again.
Widespread enough.
Yeah.
So then engage those young people in the ways that really matter. And I was going to ask you what really matters to you, but to be honest with you, I think because of time, we'll say that really matters to you.
Good.
And to be honest, that really matters to me as well. And thanks for sharing all that.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you.